Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad you all are here. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. I know there's a lot going on at this COP, so really appreciate your time and attention for the next hour. Is the sound okay? Can you all hear me? Okay, great. My name is Jessica Brown. I'm one of the directors at ClimateWorks Foundation, and our side event today is focusing on the role of philanthropy in climate change, adaptation, and resilience. Before we dive in, I do want to just give a huge thanks to our colleagues at IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development. Tom Mitchell and several other colleagues have really been instrumental, not only in this side event, but in all the work that we'll be talking about today. So huge thanks and hats off to the IIED team. So why are we here today? Well, climate change, which was once seen as a threat to our future, is now understood as the crisis of our time. The Adaptation Gap Report estimates that the costs of adaptation over the next decade are roughly around $215 billion per year, and yet the amount flowing is only 10% covering those costs. Philanthropic organizations are increasingly paying attention to the impacts of the climate crisis on countries, on communities, on the economies, on corporates, but we know that we need to do more, and we know that we can do more. So today what we're going to do is share with you all what has been the culmination of several really wonderful conversations, discussions, roundtables that have happened this year among philanthropic partners, and also to share the philanthropic call to action that's been launched today, focusing on our role in addressing adaptation and resilience. Before I dive in, I would love to just invite the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll dive into the agenda.
On? Yes. Hello, hi, I'm Dina Zayed. I'm Program Director with the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group. We are a pooled fund and a collaboration between some of the world's largest climate-focused funders. And our work supports advocacy campaigning and alignment around a multilateral and international climate diplomacy agenda.
Hi, I'm Jess Ayres. I'm the CEO of Quadrature Climate Foundation. We are a large UK-based climate philanthropy, and we work across three pillars: action to reduce emissions, action to remove emissions, and then action to manage the climate impacts.
Hi, I'm Matt Reed. I'm the CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation in the UK, and also its Global Director of Institutional Partnerships.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Robin Verkes with the Open Society Foundations, where I serve as Division Director for Climate Justice and lead our work on climate finance.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather McRae. I'm the Director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. We are a pooled fund that works on adaptation and resilience with a justice lens.
Thanks, everyone. And if I can just encourage all of the panelists to speak up a little bit. The mic is soft, so great if we can hear your voices a little bit more clearly. So for the next hour, I'll just share the agenda. I am going to share with you a little bit of the background regarding the call to action that's been launched today, and then I'll share with you some of the details of the call to action. We have a direct link to the statement that you all can see and dive into yourselves. And then we're going to have a really wonderful panel discussion, which my colleague Dina here is going to lead. And we'll also have time for questions from you all and discussion with you all as well. Okay, so just want to provide a little bit of an overview of what's been going on this year among our philanthropic partners and community regarding the conversation on adaptation resilience. So this year, in the spring, a small group of philanthropic organizations came together and realized that the conversation on adaptation resilience has been largely absent from a lot of our work on climate change. Philanthropy has done a huge amount with regards to impact and scale on climate mitigation. And yet the conversation, the dialogue, and investment on adaptation resilience has been quite stark and much smaller than what we focused on the mitigation side. So the group of foundations that I mentioned came together to organize a number of different conversations and roundtables among philanthropy to really try and understand, is there an interest, is there an appetite among philanthropic partners to do more in this area? We had one virtual roundtable over the summer, and then an in-person convening on the margins of New York Climate Week. We pulled together around 40 different foundations, and very happy to share that there is a very strong interest in doing more on climate change, adaptation, resilience. And I think the important thing to note here is that this is coming not just from the climate philanthropic community, but across philanthropy that's focused on a number of different topics, such as food security, agriculture and development, humanitarian assistance, crisis management, democracy, social justice. Philanthropic partners around the world are realizing that all of this work that we're doing is going to be made much more challenged by the fact that we're now needing to address climate impacts at the same time. So during these roundtables, during these conversations, we explored what the role of philanthropy is in adaptation resilience, and we focused on really trying to dig into our role in terms of learning, dialogue, and action. And the discussions really showed that there is a growing momentum and a growing need to organize ourselves as a community to advance this work. We also discussed what is the particular role of philanthropy in the space of adaptation resilience. And what we discussed was that our collective role can be described as helping to unlock other forms of capital, be they public or private, building innovation in policy, technology, and systems change design, acting nimbly in pursuit of bold and long-term vision, and supporting critical yet often marginalized or sidelined agendas, including those of justice movements, rights defenders, and the informal sector, and also, importantly, building alliances across society. So many of the philanthropic funders that have been part of the discussion have just launched this call to action. I'm really excited to share that we just came from a closed-door, high-level roundtable where we did launch this call to action. We had a number of really wonderful partners there, both on the philanthropic side, but also in the public and private space too. Secretary John Kerry from the US spoke about the importance of adaptation. We heard from former Secretary David Miliband, as well as Ambassador Seyni Nafo from Mali. And the statement really highlights the importance of a clear commitment and the commitment that philanthropy is now making to really take action to strengthen our investments in adaptation resilience. Here is a link, QR code for you all to take a look at the call to action yourself. We would love your feedback and input on what you think. We've had 11 philanthropic organizations sign on, and just to speak to those organizations, it's the African Climate Foundation, Aga Khan Foundation, which is represented here. Thanks, Matt, for being here. The Children's Investment Fund Foundation, the Climate Emergency Collaborative Group with Dina, Climate Works Foundation, Open Society Foundations, Robin is here representing, Quadrature Climate Foundation with Jess as the CEO of QCF, Ruma Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and Humanity United. So what does the statement say? Again, you can take a look, but in essence, it is a commitment to scale and increase our investment in adaptation and resilience. It is a commitment to develop a joint strategy. One of the things we know is that philanthropy has been active in this space, but we have not been organized, we have not been coordinated, and we have not figured out what a joint and comprehensive philanthropic strategy to support adaptation and resilience can look like. So that's one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next year or so, is really trying to map out that joint strategy and figure out where we can fit in. It's a commitment to work with others. We know that philanthropic partners cannot act alone. We need to work in partnership with multitude of stakeholders across the climate space. And it's a commitment to share our progress with you all and to be transparent about that progress. Perhaps what I'll do is, it's time for our panel discussion, but I will just pause here and just see if there's any questions or comments from the audience before we move on. Great. Well, I'm sure you will have more questions and comments once you take a look at the call to action and once you hear from our wonderful panel. Now I'm going to pass it over to Dina to take us forward with the panel. So thanks so much, Dina.
Thank you. Oh, I get to be the loud one. Thank you so much, Jess. And it's a pleasure to be here among some of our great partners who had the privilege of working with in different vantage points. Just as contextualize some of the work around the statement itself, but before I turn to the panel, I perhaps want to take a step back and contextualize the moment of COP28 and where we find ourselves in the adaptation conversation, and then therefore how philanthropy could potentially be coming in. This year, we're concluding the global stocktake, and many of us in the room would have made note of the technical dialogue synthesis, which captured over 252 hours of meetings and discussions, and 9 of the 17 key findings focused on adaptation and loss and damage. In this review exercise, we also saw, and we took collective note of the fact that there have been some shifts in the way that we talk and think about adaptation. Some of us will remember a famous politician who once said and described adaptation less than 2 decades ago as a kind of laziness, an arrogant faith in our ability to react in time to save our skins. And most of you in the room, myself included, who have been working at the intersections of international development and climate change, would know that adaptation has sometimes, and often in fact, been seen as a dirty word. One that if we acknowledged, we would be admitting failure and defeat in slashing emissions and meeting some of our temperature targets. But for my organization and our focus on the COPs, we also know that adaptation can often feel like an orphan child in a negotiation, barely a footnote to the conversation, sometimes engaged with as a residual afterthought. But this year, in the stocktake and in the UNEP GAP report, we've also seen a clear understanding that this binary is no longer realistic and is certainly not very accurate. Even if rises in temperature eventually slows because of more ambitious collective action, and even if we have managed to meet the temperature targets of the Paris Agreement, we know that climate risks will accelerate with every fraction of a degree because of compounding and cascading nature of the climate-related impacts. We also know that the IPCC concludes that residual climate risks, or the risks that would remain after ambitious adaptation and mitigation efforts, will persist even if the Paris Agreement goals are reached. So I think all of these things confirm for us, certainly at CCG, that ambitious climate action must work across all pillars of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or else none of the pieces will progress. And on that note, I'd now like to turn to each of the panelists to help answer for the audience some of the questions of how did we get here, what drove us and our respective organizations to join this coalition of funders, how can and should we be involved in the climate adaptation space, what difference does philanthropy make, what difference can it make, and what specific commitments or initiatives can we look forward to? So I'll start first with Jess, and I'd like to ask you, what was your motivation to support and provide leadership to this call for action? And where do you see the sort of process from here? What will it take for philanthropy to be more invested in adaptation support?
Thank you, Dina, and thank you for the context. I mean, I don't think I need to labour the problem. We are in a climate crisis, and unfortunately, it's taken climate philanthropy quite a long time to wake up to the fact that we have an obligation to do something about that. I think there used to be quite a lazy discourse in climate philanthropy that prevention was better than cure. And as we talked about this morning, we have prevented nothing, we've failed, and adaptation is not a cure, it's a question of survival, unfortunately, and we have a moral obligation here as climate funders to step in. Thankfully, we have our colleagues from other fields who have been waking up to this a lot sooner than we have. So we have colleagues from the human rights space, from the development space, from the food space, from the health space, all realizing the impacts of climate on their work, and we have started to learn a huge amount from them. And we have some thought leaders who have been fighting this battle for years, for decades. Jess is among them. We've got Heather McRae, colleagues from IIED, who have been gently scratching away at the climate philanthropy community for quite a long time to say, you really need to step up here. And we have heard that now, finally. So I am thrilled at QCF that we are kind of waking up to this. Adaptation is now one of the central pillars for our agenda, but we're at the beginning of the journey. And thankfully, Climate Works is bringing together a number of us that are at the beginning of this journey to work out what exactly we need to do. One of the challenges with adaptation, and the reason a lot of funders don't fund it from the climate space, is because it is so big and it is so hard and it intersects with so many other things. poverty, energy, water, foods, biodiversity. And I think the kind of the beauty of the coalition that Climate Works is bringing together is actually they're putting their arms around that and working out how you actually map it out, what the intervention points are. And it's no different to the work we're doing on mitigation, which also cuts across all of these things as well, and we manage that really well. So that's a kind of, I guess, the journey for us and for a lot of philanthropies. Where do we go from here? We've made our commitment to this agenda, but what we haven't done yet is really walk the talk. So that's the next step. And what that looks like, a few things. I'm going to put Climate Works on the hook for leading us through this now. But the first one is we're coalescing around a shared strategy. And that looks like a kind of quite a big jigsaw at the moment of different intervention points that suit different people. Once we have that shared strategy, it's then the commitments of those foundations to go in and pick off the bits of those strategies that suit their own intervention points. And at QCF, at the moment, that's looking like three things. The first one is we have a big focus on science and innovation, and there's a huge amount that can be done here from the science and innovation front, from risk mapping, from decision-making tools, from integrating some of the new adaptation technologies and getting them accessible. We're also doing quite a lot of thinking, as are many other climate philanthropies, at the other end of the scale, the macro scale, on public finance. Adaptation needs a huge amount of public finance, and it needs to be unlocked. And the transformation of the public finance agenda is as relevant, if not more relevant, to adaptation than it is to mitigation. It cuts across everything. It's about a clean, resilient transition. And then the third thing, which is a bit harder, is the institutions that connect the two. We all know that there are failings on the kind of public finance infrastructure that means some of that funding doesn't get down to the people that need it. The work on adaptation has been locally led. There is a huge amount of learning from the development space and the adaptation space about how you transform those kinds of institutions that we can now look at and bring in as part of the work that we're doing on adaptation, and we're doing work with IAD and Claire Shakir in particular on this. So I'm really excited for this agenda. I'm sad we didn't get to it sooner, and I think there's a huge amount we can do.
Thank you so much, Jess, and very helpful framing comments, actually, for the question I had for Matt. You said something about how we need to put our arms around the many intersections that adaptation entail. And Matt, as a representative of an organization that has a long track record in the development space, I'd love to ask you, what funding approaches can and should philanthropy be taking, particularly to support locally led initiatives?
Well, thank you, Dina, and thank you all for being here and for inviting us. I mean, we're a strange organization, I think, amongst climate foundations. We're not a climate foundation. We are a development organization. We work in about 20 countries around the world. We're focused on improving the quality of life in all its dimensions, promoting pluralism and enhancing self-reliance and civil society. And we've actually been working on adaptation, not mitigation. We're coming late to mitigation, actually, where it kind of flipped it over. But we've been working on adaptation, avant la lettre, decide how you want to call it, for probably 50 years, but certainly for the past 20. One of the first programs we did to rehabilitate a water system and the water table in coastal India started 20 years ago, and that work actually still continues and has grown. So from our perspective, there are two sorts of things that we think foundations like ours or otherwise ought to be focusing on. The first is to actually just start doing it, right? I mean, I think your point about understanding, and I think here we have to give credit to the UAE for really focusing us all on the way that the SDGs intersect with climate and vice versa. And so I think all foundations that are taking their portfolio of sectors seriously need to start thinking about climate. So for us, for example, in our education work, which we do globally in Central South Asia, East Africa, we have started taking climate very, very seriously. If you think about where one of the starting points for adaptation is education, in fact. We need to be educating a new generation, current people, but the next generation, for how to adapt, how to think more creatively, how to be more innovative, et cetera. So we've just launched this morning with Dubai Cares something called an accelerator that will, an education accelerator that will focus first on climate change, education, curricula, sourcing solutions from teachers. That will then actually work on unlocking funds from GPE, so it will help countries develop their own strategies for mainstreaming that in their systems. That's one example. You could talk about similar examples in health, et cetera. I think the other thing that for us that has been very important, and I think this is where philanthropy does have an advantage, for us, the community is our starting point. It always has been. So we have always started from below, not from above, as it were. And it's the communities themselves that have been telling us, we need help. The monsoon doesn't come at the same time. Droughts are longer. Rains are more intense. Flooding is more intense. There's glacial bursts, et cetera. How can help us deal with these challenges? And so that's one of the things, and I think it's a very, very important starting point, because all adaptation is local. So that as you're thinking about doing these things, it would be worthwhile to also, instead of committing to a sector, let's say, to also think about committing to places or to organizations with that deep local knowledge, right? Because that's something that's absolutely vital. And it's very, very important, of course, to make sure that those communities are at the forefront of adopting and adapting their own solutions. That's where, if you really want to do it right, you're going to get that innovation, because they know best, in fact. And so what we try to do is really facilitate that sort of human-centered design process with them.
Thanks so much, Matt. And I love that the panel makes my facilitation easier. But Heather, your work at the CGRF and the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and especially picking up on the points that Matt just raised on local community and local engagement. I know you've made some structure changes to the structure of your board, and you obviously have a tremendous amount of expertise working with really diverse stakeholders. And I think some of the points that Jess and Matt have raised is that sometimes funders are very concerned with scale and speed, and not always questioning the value of organically building grassroots networks. But to Matt's point, we also know that good ideas are those created by local communities, and those local communities are frequently left out of the conversation. So in this joint call for action, we have a long road ahead of us to think about this question of local community engagement. But I'd like to ask you a question based on CGRF's experience as well, is what have we learned from the field, and how do we structure the way that what do we learn from different delivery partners and different grassroots networks as well?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dina. And this is a very big question, and I won't be able to answer all of it, because there's a great deal that we do learn and can learn and are still learning as we engage with communities around the world on this agenda. I think one of the things that is important for funders to keep in mind, that is very clear on the ground, is that adaptation is a process. This is not something that is one and done. There is not a silver bullet out there. And many of the outcomes that are most important for communities is the establishment and maintenance of these processes, rather than some particular conclusion. And so some of the most exciting work we've supported has been building systems or capacities to sustain processes and to build movements and to gather solutions and lessons from solutions as a source of power and voice for communities that can then drive change further up from a local level to a national level, or here at the global level. So that focus on process and that focus on what really matters to communities, I think often has a lot of surprises to it. Jess and Matt, I think, both talked about how big this agenda is and how everything intersects, and it's really hard to wrap your head around it. That's a funder perspective. Many of the activists and practitioners that I work with, it's very natural to them that these things are integrated. And the silos and the conceptual challenges that we spend a lot of our time on, they don't really matter that much on the ground. And that is a relief when you see it. But it's still sometimes a challenge of bridging from that local reality into a funder's reality and back and forth. But we're finding some ways to do it. And what I'm most excited about now, and the challenge and opportunity in front of our fund, is that we have shifted how we work, and we're continuing to shift Last year, if you had talked to me, I was still reporting to a board that included representatives from each of the foundations that has pooled funding in the CJRF. That board disbanded itself, and we now have a board comprised of activists and practitioners from around the world. I don't think any of my board members are here, but if they are, they should raise their hand. It's a whole different body of experience and wisdom and insight and priorities that are now driving our fund. And it's in process. In addition to this shift in power over the fund, we're exploring ways to really shift processes so that the actual mechanisms of the philanthropy that we do involve more than just our staff and our board, that they reach out to movements and networks and community members and involve them in the decision making. So this is what we're working on right now and going forward into the next year. And it's some of what's very rich in the learning that's to be gained on this agenda.
Thank you, Heather. And with that note on whose reality matters and whose knowledge matters, it leads us straight into a question of equity. And I think a good reminder for everybody that adaptation is not politically neutral. Just like Heather says, it's a process. It's also, it's not a mere technical adjustment. It's capable of leaving people behind. It's capable of creating displacements and maladaptation. Adaptation interventions are capable of creating asymmetrical patterns of governance, and they're capable of deepening vulnerabilities. So, Robin, to turn to you, because you have a very interesting perspective and perhaps a different vantage point than some of us here on a panel, given your fundamental focus on finance and public finance in particular, but also, of course, your position at OSF and the tremendous thought leadership that OSF has had in centering questions of equity. So I'd like to ask you what you see as priorities in the adaptation and resilience space for philanthropy. What are the possible synergies around these questions that we're already, as a community, working quite well on, and where are some of the gaps where we may need to step in?
Thanks, Dina. And thanks, everyone, for being here. OSF, I wanted to start by saying, and this feels like that moment in the panel where everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. And so I want to avoid repeating what a lot of my colleagues have said here, which will be hard. OSF, Open Society Foundations, for those of you who don't know, is the world's largest funder of human rights and democracy. And it is from that lens that we come to many of these issues. For us, climate has been, among other things, a force multiplier in the threats to human rights and democracy. And adaptation becomes a matter of defending those things, as well as defending livelihoods and well-being. So one thing to remember is that these impacts, which we all know, is that these impacts are happening right now, which means lives are at stake. And we find it very important to support the movements, for them to advocate in their own names, to push upward, and to address the challenges on their own terms. And so movement support is actually something very important. On the other side of the challenge is advocacy around reforming public finance, where, as Jess was saying, it becomes very important in order to catalyze. We spent some time trying to also stand up blended finance structures for adaptation and interventions, which was a hard thing, and there's lots of lessons learned from it. But it's a place where philanthropy can actually play in trying to mobilize private capital. It's already, it's a hard issue because there aren't revenue streams in many of these spaces, and this the value proposition comes from savings. And so that's another side of the issue where we've actually been involved in trying to catalyze financing for adaptation. And it's a zone of experimentation where philanthropy can actually play a role. There's a third element which tries to connect both the movement side and the and moving large financial players in the world, which is the importance of trying to connect both through local knowledge, right? I mean, as has been said, adaptation is a very local phenomenon. I mean, and as Heather was mentioning, to people who are being affected, its intersections, its dimensionalities, its solutions are not mysterious, right? And so how do we connect that knowledge and have that knowledge and that agency drive the kinds of interventions on the other side? And so this is something that it's a kind of holism, but it's a holism of trying to bring actors together in the proper sequences. I think that's something that philanthropy can really do, and it's a role that it can, which can not just simply get purchase on the issue, but also get purchase on some of the other challenges that we're seeking to address and which have brought us to the question of adaptation.
Thank you so much, Robin. And picking up on that point on power and sort of returning to question of movements as well. I'm sure many of you have seen Oxfam's report, The Great Carbon Divide, which tells us that the richest 1% of humanity is responsible for more carbon emissions than the poor 66%. And I think the figure that struck me the most was that it would take more than 1,500 years for someone in the bottom 99% to produce as much carbon as what the richest billionaires already produce in a single year. So I'm going back to Matt now, and sort of, again, you raised this point about the SDGs and the connection between the SDGs and the climate agenda and the climate adaptation agenda. And to really ask about some of these issues of the overwhelming structures of poverty, the power realities that govern the lives of so many, and to tell us about our capacity to meet sustainable development targets and implications this has for philanthropy to protect the investments already made. So essentially, why do we need to work on adaptation from a sustainable development perspective?
Okay. I thought you were asking me if I was a billionaire and how much exactly I had contributed, which I'm not a billionaire, but I've probably contributed my fair share, as we all have. I think at some level the answer is fairly self-evident, right? I mean that as you look at any kind of public sector investment that's been made, whether it's in a hospital or it's in a road or it's in an electricity plant, certainly in the places we work, where one of the major effects of climate change is an increase in natural hazard risk. So very bluntly, I mean, it's very basic, but it's actually very, very true. So for example, to give you, we have constructed over time in southern Tajikistan a public-private partnership. It's a set of hydropower stations that provide electricity to Tajikistan and to Afghanistan. So it's absolutely critical public infrastructure. Without it, no electricity. A couple of years ago, there was a glacial burst. There was a flash flood. It knocked out the main turbine. And so the public policy planning question was, well, what do we do now? It's not cost effective actually to build a second one, but if we want to take that seriously and we want to think about what is the future of that region, then you have to start asking that question of groups like the World Bank or ADB or others who in their normal cost benefit analysis calculation would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would we want redundancy in the system? And we have to change the paradigm because in fact, what we have to do is build redundancy into the system in order precisely to make it more resilient. So I think that would be one way of answering it. And I think likewise, to come to Heather's point about local communities and them understanding how all of these things are interlinked. I think the more we can create these platforms, facilitate these local platforms, and I guess for philanthropy, it's create the kind of flexible pools of funding that they are allowed to have some agency over. So you can structure processes that allow communities themselves to choose their pathway and to use your own funding for their priorities in a way that, of course, also allowed you to comply with, we all have our compliance regimes, and if we work with the bank or others, then of course we have to apply their compliance regimes. But that can all be structured in a way that is flexible and empowering for them if we take the time to do it.
Thank you so much, and I really like this building redundancy into the system. It brings me back to Jess, also linking to something you said earlier. This has been a year of record-breaking temperatures. We know that September has most certainly been the hottest September ever by a wide margin. And you mentioned earlier QCF's commitment to science and evidence and action-oriented research. And sort of to pick up the point that Matt was making on building redundancy into the system, and also to think about your role in Quadrature's history, what role do you see for philanthropy as a bridge in catalyzing public sector finance to understand some of these challenges, build them in, building redundancy into the system, if any?
Okay, big question. So I think the obvious place to start is that philanthropic capital is extraordinary because it can take such high risk, and it is a real privilege to be able to use that. I think there is an instinct often that the best place to use philanthropic capital is in a capital stack where it can take all that risk and crowd others in, and it is being used in that way, and we are involved in some funds where it is being used in that way. But actually, there are other forms of capital that can do that as well, and for me, it's really important. Philanthropic capital is it's quite rare, so you have to make sure that you are really catalytic with it. And sometimes simply investing in a capital stack in a small, not small, any single piece of infrastructure that's not system change, right? It's going to get one thing off the ground. So we are looking at doing that in some funds, but we're actually looking at where the kind of gaps and incentives are, where philanthropic capital can actually tip the dial, move the needle, whatever you want to say. And those are things like where there is, take insurance. There is an incentive in some countries for, you only get the kind of public payout from insurance if you rebuild in the same location in the same way as you did before the disaster hit, right? That is insanity, but that is like the reality. And so the best play for philanthropy there is probably a policy advocacy play where you go to the government, you do the research on the data, you do the cost-benefit analysis, you get really sophisticated policy advocacy in there, and you try to change that policy. So simply funding someone to build back better is not really going to enact a system change, but getting that policy over the line is, and that's data and it's policy advocacy and it's legal strategies and it's finance strategies. It's all the tools that philanthropy has in its toolkit that I think sometimes are overlooked because everybody sees us as this kind of high-risk capital in the capital stack.
I'm going to keep this thread and go to Robin, and this is a great point on understanding the philanthropic role beyond the writing a check and really understanding the role for philanthropy to create coalitions, create the conditions for successful advocacy. And so to move to some of the work that you've been leading, I'm wondering where you see the line or what is within the remit of what philanthropy can support or offer support around against existing public sector finance failures, for instance, and given some of the conversations that OSF has been playing such a strong role in facilitating around a need for financial architecture reform.
So, hopefully that's not an omen. Yeah, but for a very long time, we've supported greater transparency, accountability, and participation in public financing structures. Supported groups which monitor and engage the international financial institutions, and advocate and connect those most affected into these processes for accountability. I think this is key. On the question of failures, right? A lot of these are experiments. They're bound to fail. And we know that we're taking the risks that we need to take because they fail. That's what a risk means in many ways. The question of what's done in the wake of those failures, who bears the cost of those failures, is a deep and important question. And empowering is the wrong word, trying to support organizations who are hit who bear the cost quite often of these failures, to have a say in how systems are reworked and how the lessons learned from it are actually taken up, which are relevant to them, is something that philanthropy can do and needs to do more of, right? I mean, it's in a position to help downward accountability in many of these systems, where what we see often and where we've historically seen sort of public authorities goes towards upward accountability.
This is another great point and leads me to a question for Heather, and building on the accountability question, and something that I've heard across the panel is the role that philanthropic capital has in experimenting perhaps with different models for learning, for evaluation, for monitoring, and in ways that maybe other sources of finance aren't set up to do. So could you describe some of the work that you see philanthropic leadership capable of, and when it's not necessarily about the provision of resources, but it's about building accountability into the system, about reorienting the way we understand knowledge and the way what we understand learning, and system change, to use Jess's expression?
Well, I mean, I think there's two things that are top of mind for me on this. The first is for us as funders to be very intentional about setting up learning processes, and to do that in collaboration with each other, but very importantly in collaboration with the grant partners and other implementers on the ground. And that this is not a trivial thing. So often there's some little evaluation that's done after a project or portfolio is completed, or there's a research component. We're exploring a number of different ways to really bake this learning into our work and to have it be very co-created and collaborative. But I think it's a space where philanthropy has a lot of opportunity to be very creative and to really take the long view. The other thing that's important here for accountability is support for movements, which Robin raised earlier, and the ability of people to demand accountability from their governments, from corporate actors, from all of us as funders. That's something we really need to support and buttress. And there's a lot of different ways that can happen, but we are thinking more and more about the importance of supporting movements and some of the many different ways that it's possible to support movements.
Thank you. Another great answer. We have some time for some questions from the audience, so I'd like to open it up for any questions for our panel, any questions about the statement, any comments or expressions of interest. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting panel. My name is Danielle Boyd from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. My question is, you mentioned a lot around public financing. Matt, you mentioned blended finance. Jess, you also mentioned policy advocacy, need to influence insurers. So do you have a sense, and I appreciate it's probably quite maybe early days in some of your thinking, of what the role of private finance institutions can and should be? So asset managers, pension funds perhaps, insurers and banks. Thanks.
It's a great question. Before we turn to the panel, just wondering if we can take them in twos. So if there's another question, yes, we have a question here. Okay, we'll take three questions. So one here and then one there.
Thank you so much. I'm Anemone. I'm from the Museum for the United Nations UN Live. Thank you for your insights. I actually wanted to pick up on your last remark, Heather, because in the mitigation space, there's a lot of focus on behavior change and mindset change by the many people. It's a space that we are also working in, not neglecting the fact that technical solutions are enormously important. We also believe that we do need to create that demand from the people across the world. And my question was, when we look at adaptation as a topic, it's not as clear-cut how we can both support that type of mindset change and behavior change, and it's also not clear to me how philanthropy are thinking about that role. So if you could expand a bit on that, that would be helpful.
Thank you. David Howard with the Climate Champions team. I used to be with DFID, and we used to have adaptation funding. We'd have lengthy business cases and log frames, and I see the same thing with philanthropy. So the question is, how much risk are you willing to take to ditch all your log frames and your processes to really innovate?
Okay, so we have three big questions, and I will offer the panel the choice of choosing which of those you might want to speak to. So we have a question on private finance, we have a question on adaptation mindset shifts, and we have a question on reforming the way that we count, monitor, and ditching log frames. So gesture to me, and Jess can also answer to some of these. Do you want to take the private sector one?
Thanks. Great questions. The diversity of questions are amazing. So obviously a great audience here. Just on the private finance one, the private investor piece, I mean, I think it is interesting. We kind of touched upon it, but we didn't address it directly. I think the important thing to remember is that, you know, there is not one kind of typical private investor type. There's many different types of private investment out there, and I think all of them need to play a role in this space. And there's a few examples of things that we are actively working on and/or will work to do more on, especially as we get into the strategy development. But we have some colleagues that are doing some really great work on setting up private equity funds to invest in new and innovative technologies, technological solutions that help support adaptation and resilience, especially in the food and ag space, but not limited to the food and ag space. There is great work happening on disclosure. So the, you know, sort of finance disclosure discussions do include physical asset risk. I think they need to do sort of a deeper job of addressing physical asset risk. I think it needs to be sort of a more pronounced part of the disclosure conversation. So that's certainly, I think, a role that we need to play as funders, is really elevating the importance of that. We're also starting to think about the role of public equity markets. We know that there are a number of different public equity funds that are really specifically focused on clean energy, on supporting the energy transition. Nothing has yet been done to create sort of a public equity fund on resilience, and which is something that we, ClimateWorks, along with the Bezos Earth Fund and others, are supporting. We have some leadership with Gary, the Global Adaptation Resilience Initiative, leading some of those efforts. So absolutely, and you also mentioned insurance, a few other folks mentioned insurance, the role of community-based insurance, parametric insurance, and also just providing some coverage on some of the premiums we're gonna see in insurance markets is gonna be really, really critical. So private investment is absolutely essential to what we need to do. Completely agree with Jess that, you know, there's various ways where we can use our funding to leverage significant outcomes and really get at that systems change. But pushing the private investment is going to be a really key part of that.
Thank you, Jess. Other questions, answers?
I want to take the one on monitoring and evaluation. I'm sure Heather has thoughts as well. But I'm an ex-civil servant, right? So when you are in government, you are accountable to the people on the ground that you are serving through your projects, but you're also accountable to the taxpayer. And that puts you in a really difficult position because you want to be light touch in serving your stakeholders on the ground, but you are also facing, if you're in the UK, the Daily Mail headline, which is the UK government is throwing away their money on, you know, X, Y, Z. So it's difficult. I remember that challenge. Philanthropy is different. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it probably depends on your board. But, you know, we can tip the balance here because we have the privilege of not being accountable to the taxpayers. There's pros and cons with that, right? Because it means that philanthropy isn't very accountable. So we have to make sure that we are overly accountable to the stakeholders that we are trying to serve on the ground. And it changes the evaluation question away from, like, how did you spend every single dollar to, are we investing in stuff that works? You do have a really strong obligation to make sure that what you're doing is doing no harm at a base, because we can do a lot of damage with philanthropic capital, and philanthropic capital has done a lot of damage. And we have to make sure that we are, at least what we're doing does have impact. And that might be a different perspective sometimes as you get higher up the chain than it might appear at a community level. what I really love about the way that Heather works is the kind of co-creation of that question of what impact is, so that can be led from the bottom up. And there's been a huge amount of work around community-based monitoring and evaluation and how you define those impact questions that allow you to kind of still feed in that learning question, the impact question, without letting go of it entirely. Heather, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating issue. You know, all of those log frames and reporting requirements, these compliance components of funding, they're institutionalized mistrust. That's essentially what they are. And when you flip your thinking about trust and say, I'm giving money to these people, I want them to succeed, I want to work with them to succeed, you can start to build trust in really new ways. But it does require letting go of some of those traditional tools of evidence and impact and coming up with other ones. We have substantially simplified our reporting requirements over the 7 years of our fund being in existence. We have simplified our budget template. We have whole different ways of having conversations with our grant partners now. And we're moving toward larger, longer term, more flexible grants as we build trust with our partners. But I mean, on some level you build trust, and on some level you just make choices to trust people. And if philanthropy has the freedom and the privilege to do that, and I'm really excited about what can come out of that. There's lots of risk. There's definitely still risk, but it's very different risk than you think it is. And there's risk in not trusting also, because the money bypasses people who have really powerful and important things to do with it, and who have a right to some of this money in many cases, and moral authority that we need to respect. But the institutionalized risk structures, risk intolerance structures, mistrust structures, that make it very hard to live into our best values. I thought I should also touch on this point here about mind shift changes and movements. Adaptation and resilience are such a fascinating place to work on this. Dina flagged earlier that this is fundamentally a political phenomenon, and the activists and practitioners that I work with know that deeply in really powerful ways. The ways in which historic injustices, colonization, patriarchy, you name it, racism, ethnic discrimination, all of that deeply underpins climate risk. And those communities that have been facing those challenges for generations, they have amazing analyses of climate change and the potential for this issue, adaptation to climate change, to really break through generations of awful injustice. I recommend to all of you, go to gender events, go to the Indigenous Pavilion, go listen to the young people here. They have so many amazing things to say on this mindset thing. I think mitigation movements are way behind on this, and there's a lot to learn from the adaptation and resilience side.
To say a little something about this behavior change question as well, because I think it's actually really essential, in fact, to adaptation. And if I could give an example so picking up on this India example that I gave a minute ago. So when I sat down, well, two things. So that work where we essentially helped rehabilitate the water table of coastal Gujarat. In that work, we did that through hundreds of community organizations that we helped facilitate. Most of them were women-led or all-women organizations. And there were two important things that came out of that. So when I sat with them, that was 10 years ago, but it was 10 years into the work. They said to me, you know, what has been amazing about this is that we used to not think of ourselves as connected. And through this work, we came to understand that what we do upriver affects those people downriver, etc. So it created a consciousness amongst them that they didn't have and that they took in a different direction. And then we stepped away. I mean, we're not actually funding this work anymore. They do it on their own. They've created their own structures. They engage the government on their own, etc. So I think it's really important and powerful what can happen. The second thing that happened was something that was completely unexpected. We were also in a conversation with the women's group, and they said to us, could you, you're not giving us any money anymore, but could you send us to a training on domestic violence in Delhi next week? Because this is a real problem that all of our organizations are having. And so we want to use our voice to start working on this. So I think there are unanticipated consequences of empowering people like this and really giving them that agency. And I think it's something that's very, very fundamental to what we do when we work in adaptation. Sorry, that was it. Was that an abrupt mic drop?
No, I'm just looking at Robin to say if he wanted to add something. I'm mindful we might be kicked out soon, so just giving you a time flag.
Yeah, just on the blended finance question, we did some work with a North American pension fund, which took the lead in organizing an adaptation fund, a $1.5 billion adaptation fund, with lots of innovative components, but which eventually did not go forward, despite having gone through 7 separate risk committees. And one thing we realized was that we and they were all thinking about how to mitigate against project risk, but portfolio risk management systems were not really something that we had thought through, and that was what had ultimately doomed it. And in many ways, what the private sector can do is actually, where it is more likely to think about the kind of risks it engages in operationally, to sort of be more in dialogue with philanthropy as we try to work on setting up these systems. I think that's, in some ways, like private sector can teach us.
Thank you so much, Robin. I know we're coming close to time, and there might have been some more questions, so I apologize to anyone that didn't get a chance to ask those. I'll just wrap up by saying that today we've talked about the important and catalytic role that philanthropies can play in the climate adaptation space. And a few things that stood out to me from this conversation, and I also want to say that this is, even in the span of this hour, I've learned so much from everyone on the panel, so I want to say thank you personally, that this has been a very enjoyable and rich discussion. But one of the things that stands out is that we need better definitions and understanding of what philanthropy can actually fund when it comes to adaptation, but also who is defining that for us and who are we listening to and engaging with that question and with the answer for that. I think something that comes across to me is that philanthropy cannot necessarily be expected to displace or substitute public finance or to fill implementation or pledging gaps, not least because it's not a very sustainable solution, but also because it erodes from the principles of justice, both compensatory and redistributive and procedural, that need to be at the heart of our international climate action process, and particularly in this negotiation. And I say this particularly as this year we seek to understand what a global goal on adaptation may look like. The other thing that seems very clear to me is that philanthropy can and should be doing a lot more on campaigning and availing the resources to generate the kind of evidence that we need to get to grips with what is more equitable adaptation practice and what does that look like on the ground. We can be playing a role both as a social and financial, leveraging social and financial capital between multiple different kinds of worlds. We're in conversation with multiple different kinds of communities, and the field therefore has an opportunity to showcase how stronger co-created projects can actually center people first and how those can be executed on the ground. Putting this quite simply, I think to me it seems that we have a role to play in evidencing impact for adaptation project in a manner that doesn't simply favor the rule of experts. And I think in 5 or 6 different ways I've heard all of you speak to this point that transformative leadership is decentralized, it's diffused, it's often local, it requires creativity, it requires flexibility in funding, and that we need to be thinking about supporting movements and supporting system learning and accountability structures and accountability architectures and pathways, and that all requires patient capital. And it all requires learning systems that don't expect to be resolved and lessons within a 6 months and 12 months span. And so with that notion, it seems that part of our shared goal here, and to start off with a point that I've learned so much from this panel, is that this is also, this call for action is also a call for us to exchange practical experiences and to promote a culture of action-oriented learning and praxis-driven research in even the way that we speak amongst ourselves as a philanthropic community. And it's certainly fitting for us to be hosted by the Resilience Hub that has been, to Heather's point, playing such a leading role in shaping some of these conversations around praxis-driven research and learning. I was also reminded, and to sort of say the final thing here, of a quote from Yeats about "In dreams begin responsibility." And I would like to close the session by saying that what seems to unite this group is a shared aspiration, and maybe let's call it a dream, that we can and we should be doing a lot better as a community in deepening our coordination, and both with each other and in the field, for more effective and more equitable funding change. And that dream cannot be toothless. And perhaps speaking on behalf of everyone here, we have a shared commitment to working together to take up the responsibility that comes with that dream so that we can move forward with it. So as we look ahead, you'll see behind me here the QR code once again that links to the full statement. Please send an email to our champion-in-chief, Jessica Brown, from the Climate Works Foundation to continue the conversation. And please consider joining the learning dialogues or the action tracks that are part of this process. I will also say that we are at very different stages of this vital conversation, both as individuals and as representatives in organizations. Heather and Jess, I think, made points about our risk tolerance structures and our boards. I had a board member that was here and left, so I feel comfortable saying, oh, he's back. Theo, all right. I'll say it to him privately, but but just to remind us that the individual, the institutional, and the board structures all need to go on those journeys, and within those journeys, they're at different stages. So please join me in giving everyone a round of applause, and to this great audience for the great questions that you've raised. And we very much look forward to a successful negotiation on adaptation this year, and looking ahead to COP29. Thank you.